Good evening and welcome to the Wadsworth Atheneum. I am Patricia Hickson, the Emily Hall Tremaine Curator of Contemporary Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce this program. The Tony Smith Foundation's inaugural presentation of a nomadic program called In Dialogue that will place Tony Smith's legacy in the context of and in dialogue with contemporary artists. Matrix on the art of Tom Burr, Torkwase Dyson, and Tony Smith is co-organized with the Tony Smith Foundation and the Wadsworth Atheneum. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Wadsworth enjoyed an extended engagement with American artist, sculptor, painter, architect, designer, teacher, and writer, Tony Smith. Smith's presence at the Wadsworth included his part in a major group exhibition, a solo exhibition, an acquisition of his sculpture, several gifts of sculpture by Tony Smith, his gift of 7 major abstract paintings to the Wadsworth's collection, including artists Jackson Pollock, Barnett Newman, Clifford Still, Mark Rothko, and others. And he was a key advisor on the development of the Matrix program of contemporary art exhibitions. And you'll hear more about Tony Smith from James Voorhies. This program was initiated by a recent long-term loan from the Tony Smith estate, currently on view in the Huntington Gallery. The sculptures, 2 sculptures, one by Tony Smith and the other by Jackson Pollock, were made by the artists side by side in Smith's backyard in July of 1956. It was an early sculpture for Smith. He had been focused on painting at the time, but it was a return to sculpture for Pollock, whose first artistic interest was sculpture. After struggling for a new direction in his painting practice, Pollock was experimenting with sculpture again. This was one of the last works made by Pollock, who would die in a car accident the following month. When James Voorhies and I started discussing a program, instead of looking to the past, as in Tony Smith's artistic circle of friends, James insightfully suggested a program about Smith's legacy featuring contemporary artists. We quickly landed on Tom Burr, whose Matrix 182 exhibition at the Wadsworth in 2019 had included references to Tony Smith. And James suggested Torkwase Dyson, whose 2018 exhibition, Scalar, was presented at Bennington's Usden Gallery. Her project also engaged with Smith, who had been an instructor at Bennington College around 1960. Tonight's program will begin with a presentation by James Voorhies, the executive director of the Tony Smith Foundation, followed by a conversation with James and artists Tom Burr and Torkwase Dyson about their work. And we will leave some time at the end for questions. I'd like to thank the Tony Smith Foundation for partnering with us on tonight's program, the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for its support, and the Wadsworth's Adam Lenz for his thoughtful organization of the program tonight and for taking the lead in producing this really terrific brochure, which is a first for us to accompany such programs. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming James Voorhies to the stage.
Thank you very much, Patty. I appreciate that. I mean, the Tony Smith Foundation really is delighted to launch our nomadic program series called In Dialogue, fittingly, as Patty said, in the very institution that launched Tony Smith's artistic career. And those details, I hope, will become clear as the evening progresses. But first, I really want to thank Patricia Hickson, who has been a real delight to work with and to research on this program and to organize it with. I'm grateful for that partnership. I also want to thank the Wadsworth Ann Rice, Director of Education, and Adam Lentz, Public Engagement and Programs Manager, who are both so organized and so attentive to the details. And this afternoon, Eric Bowen and Rick Bogdan were really so very patient with the AV and setting everything up, and I'm really grateful for that. And I also want to thank Tom Burr and Torkwase Dyson for participating in the program. And on behalf of the Tony Smith Foundation and its board, I really want to say how grateful we are for your time and your attention, and that you're here to launch this series with us. It means a lot. So I will talk for about 20 minutes, and I intend to do three things. First, I want to introduce the connection between Tony Smith and the Wadsworth that Patty mentioned. And second, I want to look a bit at this term matrix, that we're using it as a kind of guide or prompt for the evening. And lastly, I want to introduce the work of Tom Burr and Torkwase Dyson, specifically as it relates to Smith and more generally to the ingrained narratives of modernism out of which his work evolved. And so the goal of the introduction here then is to provide a kind of common ground for everyone to set the stage, so to speak, for the conversation to follow with Tom and Torkwase. So here we go. So this is a scene of the Avery Court, which many probably recognize here at the Wadsworth Atheneum. The year is 1964. This is a group exhibition titled Black, White, and Gray, Contemporary Painting and Sculpture, curated by Samuel Wagstaff, who was the museum's curator of painting and sculpture from 1961 to 1968. Black, White, and Gray occupies a really rather important place in the history of art. It was the earliest cohesive presentation of an aesthetic that would eventually become known as minimalism. The exhibition included work by Agnes Martin, Robert Morris, Barnett Newman, Frank Stella, Anne Truitt, among many others. 50 paintings and sculptures by 21 American artists were presented in the exhibition. And these two photographs are the only existing documentation that we believe, there might be more, but it shows how the modernist works were enveloped the early 17th century marble by the French artist Pietre Francavilla, which is installed, as you know, in the very same spot today. Black, White, and Gray featured one work by Tony Smith, a paired wall-like construction, each module 8 feet square by 2 feet deep. It is titled The 11s Are Up, and it can be seen here in this image in the very far background, kind of black blob. But this is a slide here of a photograph of a later edition of the work, made in steel, shown here installed in a museum in Denmark. Tony Smith was 51 years old when he exhibited this work in Black, White, and Gray, and it was the first exhibition ever to include a work by him. This is a scene, again, of the Avery Court at the Wadsworth. The year now is 1966. This is Smith standing in front of his work titled Fixture. The immobile classical sculpture, juxtaposed against the modernist works in Black, White, and Gray, no doubt left an impact on Smith's intervention, indeed to cover it with his own fixture. The left photograph here shows, obviously, the work being installed. The sculpture there is wrapped in plastic. Fixture was one of 18 sculptures in the first solo exhibition by Tony Smith. Organized by Wagstaff, the exhibition was concurrently presented in two different institutions, the Wadsworth and the ICA in Philadelphia. This is a photograph of Smith and Wagstaff standing in front of the plywood mock-up of the 1961 Spitball, which was installed at that time on Travelers Plaza across the street from the museum. And this is a photograph of a plywood mock-up of Amaryllis, which was included in the exhibition, shown here in front of the main entrance to the museum. Amaryllis was eventually fabricated in steel, painted black, and it's currently installed on the west lawn of the museum. So not only did the Wadsworth present for the first time a work by Smith in a group exhibition and organize the first solo exhibition by him, Amaryllis is the first work by Tony Smith to enter a museum collection. Under Wagstaff's recommendation, the museum acquired it in 1967. The same winter as the solo exhibition, 1966, Smith was interviewed by Samuel Wagstaff for an article in Art Forum. The interview was part of a slew of criticism by figures such as Michael Fried, Rosalind Krauss, and Lucy Lepard, who would anoint a generation of artists whose interests lie in experimenting with geometric forms and spatial volumes. And although more aligned generationally with the abstract expressionists, Smith became part of these rapidly evolving discourses on painting and sculpture in the 1960s. Now it's February 1967. A few months after the Art Forum interview, Vogue magazine published an article featuring that spring's new fashion. The shoot was photographed in Smith's exhibition at the Wadsworth. Here in this image, you can see an unpainted mock-up of Cigarette, which is right there in the center, with the model's right foot on the far left on the model of Cigarette. At the bottom of this image is a series of photographs of Amaryllis. You can see at the very bottom. Those photographs were also published in the catalog for the Wadsworth ICA exhibition. Now, it's October 1967, just shortly, a few months after the Vogue magazine. Tony Smith, just over 3 years earlier, had never shown a work in a public exhibition. He is here, pictured on the cover of Time magazine. He is seen from above standing under the plywood mock-up of his sculpture Smoke, which had just been installed at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Samuel Wagstaff and the Wadsworth Atheneum were instrumental in initiating all of this and in advancing Tony Smith's artistic career. This history I know is well known to some of you, but I thought that it would be worth reiterating and introducing to others within tonight's guiding theme, which is matrix. So this term matrix obviously has a few different associations and meanings. On one hand, it signals that something is part of a larger whole. It is part of a kind of ecosystem or an enveloping support structure. One might think of the incubation of mineral crystals and organic cells. In the art world, the concept of matrix can literally be applied to the creative practices of many artists and curators. They depend on vast networks, fabricators, gallerists, audiences, and institutions, critics, curators, professors, and collaborators, each supporting one another, playing complementary roles to bring work into the public realm. That kind of support structure, I believe, is evident even in this introductory overview of the early years of Tony Smith's artistic career. One can see, for example, in the documentary photographs like these, the teams of fabricators and builders who worked with Smith on his projects. And this is just a small selection of photographs showing that numerous people were often involved in making work for Tony Smith, and it certainly did not happen in a vacuum. And in this final image, one could say Smith's sculpture is tackled using a different approach, I guess less making and more playing. This is a photograph of Smith's For Marjorie, which is installed on MIT's campus in Cambridge. So it's no surprise then that an exhibition program named Matrix, founded here at the Wadsworth in 1975 by then director James Elliott, to support experimental modes of artistic creation in dialogue with a curator and in the context of a museum collection, acquired its name aptly from Tony Smith. Smith had been invited to sit on the committee responsible for creating just such a program. His own roving practice transcended mediums. His own complex artworks are based on interrelated part, yet ultimately everything thrived due to his committed long-term relationships with curators, artists, institutions, and fabricators. And as James Eliot wrote in the program's founding document, which is pictured here, quote, "The working title for the project for a number of years was New Aspects and Review." Tony Smith suggested the title Matrix, which, with emphasis on the definition of it as a space within which something else originates and develops, end quote. So tonight we have the great pleasure of talking with two artists, Torkwase Dyson and Tom Burr, who, in different bodies of work, have engaged with the aesthetics and the ideologies of modernism. And what we intend to explore tonight is the compositional character of their practices. They connect concepts, they connect ideas across exhibitions and mediums, across years. This is achieved in part through a kind of matrix thinking, through thinking compositionally as an approach to an artistic practice where the exhibition or the publication or the performance offer a kind of core sample of a much larger entangled body of work. But before we begin, I want to take a few more minutes to introduce their work within the context of tonight's program. So first, Torkwase Dyson. The year now is 2018. These are photographs of Dyson's solo exhibition titled Scalar, curated by Ann Thompson at the Ousdan Gallery at Bennington College. Excuse me. Dyson uses the visual language of abstraction as a site of artistic intervention for rethinking the impact that aesthetics has on defining space and social control. The unclassifiable nature of her work offers the potential for cultivating new aesthetic vocabularies. In turn, new vocabularies can give work, actually anything, the potential to redefine things, like art, history, and even society. In other words, I think if we don't know how to interpret something, how to relate to it, we don't know how to read it, that uncertainty actually offers potential to go against what is understood as reason, offers potential for new readings. At Bennington, these ideas materialized in a group of works related to the long history of abstraction at the college. Figures such as Pat Adams, Paul Feely, Helen Frankenthaler, Jules Olitsky, and Tony Smith are part of the college's history. Smith was an instructor from 1958 to 1961. He taught courses in painting and architectural design. In 1961, aided by students, he built a huge semi-architectural work based on polygon forms. It is called Bennington structure. Smith's Bennington years mark an important transition in his career. He began to explore new aesthetic vocabularies to move away from the applicable function of architectural design to the experimentations with pure form that sculpture offered. Dyson is interested in systems, mathematics, and geometries as ways to reflect artistically upon the properties of scale and dimension. Indeed, the term scalar, which she used for the title of her exhibition, refers to a quantity that has magnitude but no direction. In mathematics, a scalar is a single real digit, attached to nothing. It is an entity all its own. It is without the constitutions and conditions of others. In art and society, a scalar could be equated to abstraction, an ever-shifting elusive mass, conceptual, material, could be spatial or social. Abstraction is freedom from representation. While parts of her exhibition were in conversation with these histories at Bennington, Dyson has remarked that she was not necessarily thinking through Tony Smith and his contemporaries. She saw them in terms of moments of abstraction to take, turn, and use for other means. Abstraction in this light, which we'll talk about later here, then becomes a fertile space for rethinking what might be seen as conventional aesthetics. It becomes a means to explore how infrastructures write and also progressively write out histories and processes of social and structural inequities. Okay, now Tom Burr. The year is 2019. We are again back at the Avery Court. This sculpture is titled Sam I Am by Burr. Created as part of his Matrix exhibition titled Hinged Figures, curated by Patricia Hickson, this work is a continuation of Burr's use of the hinged figural form to explore the inextricable bond that bodies have with architectural space. Burr's interests lie in how the queer body, and being queer, molds and contorts according to the physical spaces and social contexts determined, in this case, by the aesthetic infrastructures of the dominant heterosexual culture. Sam I Am was one of 8 sculptures installed in conversation with a selection of artworks throughout the museum and in the nearby Austin House, former home of Chick Austin, the glamorous art historian who at age 26 and who was homosexual, became director of the Wadsworth Atheneum in 1927. Sam I Am recalls an earlier intervention of the same sculpture, the museum's iconic marble by Francavilla. But whereas Smith's triangulated plywood form completely enclosed the ornate neoclassical marble, extending the box-like form to the cantilevered balconies, Burr's sculpture, a malleable hinged figure, was supported by a black plywood plinth spanning the width of the fountain. Photographs called from the museum's archive show couples juxtaposed in formal attire dancing near the Francavilla sculpture. Burr juxtaposed these with covers of the journal Mattachine, published by the Mattachine Society, a national gay rights organization founded in 1950. Then the 1966 photograph of Smith and Wagstaff that you see here, standing in front of the Spitball, was placed partially under one of the covers of Mattachine. Sam I Am represent Burr's ongoing engagement with the aesthetics and discourses related to the work of Tony Smith. Black Bulletin Board from 1998 here, for example, takes the form of an informational bulletin board as a site for presenting a collection of black and white photographs picturing the supple, angular surfaces of Smith's sculptures, penned alongside stills from the 1968 film Scorpio Rising by Kenneth Anger. The refined, polished surfaces of Smith's work become queered, or at least unreadable, using conventional aesthetics, eroticized next to the equally refined and polished surfaces of male bodies and leather jackets in Kenneth Anger's films. In another gallery at the Wadsworth, Burr installed a work titled Perfume. This gallery is devoted to showcasing 7 abstract expressionist paintings donated by Tony Smith and his wife Jane Smith in 1967. Perfume co-mingled with paintings such as Barnett Newman, Jackson Pollock, and Mark Rothko, a social milieu of luminaries, all heterosexual males whose big public personas then and now convey a hyper-masculinized prowess. The black geometric quality of Burr's hinged figure here recalls the aesthetic characteristic of works by Smith in the museum's collection. The black marble edition of Spitball, for example, from 1961, and a unique piece, lacquered wood sculpture titled New Piece from 1966 are installed nearby. And in a kind of circular nature, back to where we began, this work, the latter, was gifted to the Wadsworth Atheneum by the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation, having been owned by Robert Mapplethorpe's lover and patron, Samuel Wagstaff. And the Matrix, it does seem, kind of goes on with a kind of forever presence. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And then please join me in welcoming Tom Burr and Torkwase Dyson up here to the stage too.
All right.
Okay.
Well, I want to say again how grateful we are to both of you that you're here tonight. I appreciate you being part of this program. I also really appreciate having the time to think about your work in relation to Tony Smith's work over the past number of weeks, also being very familiar with it before this program. So it's been really nice to be involved in your work in that way. Since I thought we could start, though, since I just introduced some of the work that's here and the two projects specifically, that we might just start out by talking about the genesis of your interest in Tony Smith, and even more generally, like sort of the modernism, especially in relation to these two projects. Torkwase, do you want to maybe start first?
Sure, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and really talk about and think alongside Tony Smith and Tom. When I was invited to the Houston Gallery to think and make in the space, initially I had, my intentions were to think about what does it mean to work in multiples? What does it mean to produce sort of the self-generating forms in relationship to industry, in relationship to the ways in which industry is propagated through infrastructures, both materially and economically. And when I landed in the gallery and was able to sort of make in the space, those guidelines really sort of loosened up when I really focused on Tony's practice of drawing and making and in the space and the haptic. So what I really was interested in doing was thinking about these sort of experiential moments and corporeal moments in the space that sort of went against what I thought industry or multiples was doing to my own political thinking. And through that sort of encounter with Tony's very sort of haptic intentions around multiples and making and sculpture, and my own interest in sort of infrastructure, I began to think about scale in a very different way, hence scalar. So when thinking about the way Tony Smith deals with geometry, it really, and we were talking about this earlier, where his works have no sort of front, back, and side. They have no, for me, they don't read specifically as directional, right? I think about their mass and then I think about their magnitude. And, when that sort of occurred to me, and I sort of let that seep into my own drawings, this exhibition, I made a lot of the paintings in the gallery. So a lot of that with the string, tension, line, horizon lines, and these moments of sort of architectural interventions, I sort of dove into the haptic as a way to think about refusing the kind of modernization that would disappear people, right? The kind of modernization that would create dispossessions through sort of really violent infrastructure. So it was a really good way, thinking with these sort of modulations to make work that had both a sort of diagrammatic interest in space, but also a very expressive hand. So yeah, that's what happened in the gallery.
And I think, like, also because abstraction is so important to you, and I think it's something we'll talk more about tonight as well, but like coming into such a rich space as Bennington, where abstraction plays such an important history there, I sense that it must have been a very fertile space for you as well. Not to necessarily like reproduce it, but also, yeah, maybe talk a bit about like what does abstraction offer you as what kind of potential do you see in abstraction, and maybe that you encountered while working on this project?
Sure. So I think of abstraction as this kind of condition of different registers: political abstraction, social abstraction, economic abstraction, spatial abstraction. So my theories around abstraction as a Black woman is specifically to focus on the ways in which abstraction has erased, dispossessed, misrepresented images and bodies and spaces. So my sort of entry into abstraction is to say, how do I survive it, right? So when I think about abstract painting in the art world with a capital A, I carry that with me, right? So when I'm thinking about someone like a Helen Frankenthaler and the drips and the pores and the liquidity, I'm thinking about this in relationship to my own making, right? So the sort of drip, pour, liquidity, I am able to think about geography. I'm able to think about water. I'm able to think about structure. And I'm also able to think about systems in the ways in which, geographies have been used and water as geography has been used. So abstraction to me sort of hits at many different registers. And making art with the intention of both engaging the history of abstraction as a politic and as a sort of canon, those things are tied up. They're indelibly tied for me. So this is the way in which I sort of produce a practice where abstraction, because of that those sort of indelible ties, sort of kind of, it is able to generate for me new forms in my work.
It has great potential in that sense. Yeah. Before we move on, because both of you, these projects also have engaged with institutions in a different way, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I'm curious, like, what did your engagement with Bennington look like while you were there in terms of the faculty or the students, and just learning also about that history and being part of it?
At Bennington, it was a really sort of straightforward exhibition, installation, research practice. And that sometimes working in the academy, what is really generative are the students who are able to not only engage with the practice of making sort of in this immediate way, but you're also able to tap into what they're working on at the time, right? So, of course, we went into the sculpture department, we looked at the painting facilities, we looked at the space where Tony had worked. We went into the archives. So this kind of discursive condition really made its way into the making. So that larger painting that you showed earlier, I think it was 10 by 20 feet, because we put the canvas in the space, and then it was stretched later. So we brought the liquid, lots of water and paint in the space, spread the canvases out. And the students and I were really able to, this is another condition and why I am interested in Tony's work as well, like gravity was really present, right? This idea of like gravity and form and movement was really present in the painting. And it went from something, sort of this fabric, wet, sort of viscous surface, to something that was more structural when it was wrapped around the stretcher. And then with the students, I was able to say, hey, what kind of forms are you guys working on? So part of the sculpture, part of the painting at the bottom, that little architectural sort of cliff, was really pulled from the sculpture department, right? So we were able to pull that clip, and I said, I'm going to use that in the painting and take it off the wall.
That little clip that's hanging between the sculptures?
The aluminum at the bottom, on the painting on the wall.
Okay.
So one canvas is on the wall and the other is off the wall. So trying to bring the canvas off the wall and use architecture really to make this sort of precarious moment. So as you know, precarity is a really huge part of my composition. So I was able to sort of use the university, use a classroom to sort of bring that precarity into the physicality of the painting. And lastly, it was, a really turning point in my work where we were able to engineer these sort of clips, I call them doohickeys, clips on the paintings that allow for that really taut string. So in a couple of the paintings, we engineered these clips, meaning we designed them and laser cut them on campus and produced maybe like 20 of them, and they made their way into 3 of the paintings. So this sort of hardware sort of made its way into painting for the first time. So I was able to sort of lift the string off of the painting and maybe about 1/2 inch, and sort of make this really strong diagrammatic line across the work. So this sort of rectilinear condition was really on multiple planes,
Yeah.
right?
I like that also. I mean, just in terms of thinking about Tony Smith transcending like design, architecture, sculpture, and painting, and there's a fluidity among the different ways in which he worked through all of that. And also something thinking about like the teaching as an, I don't want to say it for you, but for Tony Smith, like teaching was very important as for his practice, where a lot of experiments would take place, where he could work with the students. I mean, the Bennington structure, similarly, while at Bennington, he made those with a group of students, and there's other stories as well as when he was at Hunter and so forth. So, and we can hold this thought, but I know from your other projects too, like how important that pedagogical space is in terms of and also a making space, and it's really. Okay, there's a lot more to ask about that, but Tom, can you talk a little bit about the project that you made here at the Wadsworth?
It was nice to be back at the Wadsworth. I can talk about that. Maybe I'll back up a little bit and talk about my sort of early engagement with the art of Tony Smith, which sort of laid some of the groundwork of what and why I did here at the Wadsworth. So I think that my interest in the work of Tony Smith and many of his contemporaries, as well as predecessors, had to do with my desire at a fairly young age to find other figures to step into, other forms to step into as well, other forms to appropriate, but also other figures to step into to sort of denaturalize where I was standing. So I took what was probably quite a natural inclination and into a certain kind of work that I was interested in, and tried to sort of destabilize it at a certain point. So I wanted to work out of text by Robert Smithson, for instance. I did a lot of work that preceded my engagement with Tony Smith that came directly out of Smithson's last text, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Dialectical Landscape. And then at a certain point, I wanted to work more rigorously with the idea of form and sculpture, but in a somewhat self-conscious way, perhaps. And I think when I landed on Tony Smith as an idea, as something that I could gather up and bring over to where I wanted to work with it, it had to do with clues that he was already presenting in his work. So he was part of this minimalist generation. He was a white man, straight man. He was all those things that I wanted to sort of push against and move against. But he also allowed something else that led me to something that I think about relative to his work and took on, which has to do with the idea of interiority. So on a very basic level, or a structural level, or physical level, there is this notion of what's inside, right? There are these forms, these boxes, these containers, these spaces within that I became interested in. So I wanted to sort of, and the clues that I'm suggesting that he gave me through his work have textual ones, have to do with his titling and his forms that start to resemble things. So they're not entirely, cigarette is a perfect example, or dye. These things that start to allude to a certain kind of narrative, a somewhat dark narrative often, and sometimes humorous narrative. Those things were sort of hooks in for me. And then the other, so this idea of appropriation of his work, which I also was doing with other artists at the same time, and sort of merging my persona with theirs, merging my work with theirs, and taking that on. The other aspect of his work that became important for me was this idea of resemblance and this sort of horizontal ability to one thing to resemble another. And so with Black Bulletin Board from tell me, 1988, I was interested in the simultaneity of the fact that black box other works by Tony Smith also had this strange concurrent relationship to the film made at the same time, the film of Kenneth Anger. And what interested me most with that was their sort of potential opposition. They're seemingly belonging to different canons, visual canons. I also was very interested in the idea that these kinds of plywood structures, which I think is the thing that interested me most about Tony Smith, that he worked in these sort of models, that he worked in throwaways, and then sometimes permanence entered the picture, but not always. I liked that amateur versus professional. I like that tension. And I work that way too, and I struggle with it. Something that I put into my work, but I also struggle with it. I struggle with permanence and impermanence. And the art world with a capital A's desire for permanence versus impermanence, and all of those tensions that suggests. But I was interested in that notion of resemblance when he worked with matte black plywood specifically, that started to resemble the bars and spaces that I occupied at the time, that were protective spaces for me in queer communities. That kind of interiority, social interiority, became important to me relative to his work, and the notion of inverting that, inverting what we encounter as form into something of an interior space, a psychic space, but also a social space, of safety, of precarity, of both, started to interest me as well. And then when I was asked to do a show at the Wadsworth Atheneum many years later, I was interested in all these points of connection. And obviously it goes exactly back to what you said, James, about the idea of matrix. Because one of the things that I wanted to do was sort of ground the fact that I had already done this, that I had already been there, that I'm quoting myself. And when I had done an exhibition at the Sculpture Center in New York City, and I referenced Chick Austin, and I referenced, and that Perfume, the piece that you referred to earlier, was from that show. Now I was returning those works that had been done sort of off-site and remotely to their, in some ways, their original location, and that created a whole different set of possibilities. And then what I wanted to do here, the Matrix was a program, but it was very, and it suggested this idea of a fluid network of possibilities, but it was very architecturally grounded in one particular room, one particular gallery, which is very typical of an encyclopedic museum, which is what the Wadsworth is, where this department is over here, this department is over here, and the contemporary department was housed in a room called the Matrix Gallery. And I had been quite inspired by Nicholas Baum's exhibition several years earlier of Saul Lewitt's Incomplete Open Cubes here in the Wadsworth Atheneum, where they had each of these cubes had been placed throughout the museum in the different departments. And that just seemed like a model to bring forward again. So Patty and I worked with the different departments to do that. And that was because I wanted to see these hinged figures in these different locations, but I also wanted to touch these different locations. I wanted to activate that matrix of forms. And one thing that's important to know about the hinged figure exhibition that we did here at the Wadsworth, in addition to each one of these hinged figures' histories, original locations, stories, figures, personas that they may reference, several of them were on loan. I very self-consciously wanted to create a loan exhibition in part, although I also created works for this exhibition, because I wanted to have that sort of strange tension of works being owned, coming from elsewhere, and that matrix being further. So for me, the matrix goes beyond the people that might help me make my work. They're the people that take the work away from me, that help me through that, but also alienate me from my work. And so that network becomes much more complicated. And I wanted to try to touch that network, that matrix, those levels with the exhibition here. And I do think I'm very much in agreement with your suggestion that Tony Smith was somewhat self-consciously working that way as well, that there was partnering occurring. That we we always work with, an artist always works with their curators, their collectors, their dealers, etc. But there are ways to highlight that work. There are ways when that work gets spotlit and not naturalized and put into the background. And that's something that I wanted to do with the hinged figure exhibition.
how did the hinge figure that had already been made and showed in a different context, how did it read in this context? Or did it read differently? Did you set it up differently?
You know, my work has always dealt, my mind has always dealt with legacies of site specificity. I've always come out of that. That was my schooling, my thinking, but it was never entirely adequate, and it wasn't then. It was now, and so I was always trying to think about how to become, and I thought it was curious about discussing your program, and the word you use, nomadic, which is a word that I would often use in relationship to my work relative to an artist like, for instance, Richard Serra, who's, when I did my sort of riff on his Tilted Arc, with my work, Deep Purple, his being in corten steel, mine being in plywood, again, this dynamic that Tony Smith uses between the model, the impermanent, the unprofessional, the less professional, the more made for the centuries material of steel. That tension interested me. But when I started to work that way, I also wanted to incorporate a notion of site specificity as nomadic, so that the work becomes always carries the residual content with it. So there are all sorts of other structures that we have. For instance, on many of the slides tonight, I wanted to tweak them. I hadn't submitted them myself. I should have, but some of the original locations weren't named. I like those original locations to be named because that kind of information carries forward. So to your exact question, you know, the fact that Christmas Collapse, which was one of these small pieces that had a bit to do with Truman Capote, was put into this period room here, where it had been only ever in white cube gallery spaces before, where it seemed very kind of lost, and there's some kind of sentiment that gets attached to it there. So yes, they read differently in each space, but I've become more interested in the fact that they can be read differently in different spaces. Not any one reading necessarily, but the fact that unhinges your notion of any work being it unleashes a kind of fluidity in the work. It unleashes the possibility of multiple readings, of context being absolutely determinate in the reading of a work.
Right, I think so. It actually thwarts the notion of site specificity in that sense. I feel like both of you actually play with, of course, space very importantly, but also work that is specific to a certain context, but then can be moved into or become significant and contingent on another context. And both of you talked about things like, all these things come to my mind, like aesthetics and body, contingency, collaboration, and curating are some things I'm thinking about. But I think we hold some of these thoughts, and then maybe, Torkwase, let's move on, and you could talk about, I'm really curious to bring some of these ideas forward to talk about some recent projects here, like this exhibition that just happened last year in London. And maybe we could just start off by talking, because these forms are very significant in this exhibition. And I'd love to hear you just talk a bit about those to start.
Sure. So we were talking about something earlier in relationship to liquidity and forms and place and geography. So another reason why I was so interested in Tony Smith is that I understood from writings about him that his desire to create forms that attended to spirituality and architecture that hadn't necessarily been done in the United States was a way in which he practiced, right? That there's a space to invent through drawing and making and geometry that could take us to a bodily, a physical, a spiritual experience that we hadn't gone before. So this idea of invention through geography. So in my work, I knew that I needed a sort of system to work off on, again, to respond to other systems. And so I created a condition for myself in language called the hypershape. And the hypershapes are geometries culled from enslaved people who freed themselves, right? By way of architecture, by way of infrastructure. So I focused on these three figures that had used architecture and infrastructure to free themselves. And those, long story short, those geometries, 90-degree angle, the curve, and the irregular triangle. So these three geometries now in my work sort of are indelibly tied, and I reconfigure them through systems of drawing. So here you see the curve, the irregular triangle, and a bit of the 90-degree at one point of the sculpture. So this piece is titled, what is it? Liquid of Place. The argument that I'm making with this geometry is that our bodies bring the water in the room, right? So making sculpture that is to be occupied and occupiable, making it out of the space of these geometries that are culled from liberation practices is the form that I'm pushing, right? How do I invent new kinds of forms that speak to throughways, that speak to horizon, that speak to volume, weight, mass, and movement and modularity, right? So Liquid of Place was an installation that I made in London that allowed that kind of possibility, right? And to create spaces that were unfixed. And also, Tuttle talks about, when he writes about Tony Smith, something really beautifully that I thought that I would somehow engage in. And he talks about how Tony would engage in space in front of him and like wait for something to appear in the space. Like that space was waiting to be occupied itself as a form. So I'm interested in that, like space as form, sort of waiting to be occupied in a particular way, but gently, without violence, and particularly space being, itself waiting to be occupied. If I'm going to do that, I want to be aware of the politics of how people turn space into form and how people use form to, again, dispossess, but also to liberate. So this exhibition was really the first time I had created a form where one hypershape was in another hypershape, right? So I took irregular triangle and inserted it into the curve. Yeah. And usually they're either side by side or in different ways. So yes, this is a part of that drawing. I made these drawings in London as well, trying to get at that sculpture. Yeah. Right. So I trying to get at that, that shape. So drawing is, again, drawing is a huge part of my practice, over and over and over. Again, trying to get out a form that.
I think like it is like Tony Smith, because also the way in which he utilized like octahedrons and tetrahedrons. Absolutely. And they're geometric forms that are stationary, and they have a rational quality to them, but then putting them together into an irrational form that was still stabilized, that was still a something that one had to engage with, but they speak to an irrational kind of composition that's made from rational collection of forms. And I love like that this overlap of like the stationary geometric forms that come into the larger, and also the way a lot of, in this case not all, but there's a kind of pressing against the interior space where it's uncomfortably large within it, the dimensions.
That tension where, sorry, the mic, where Tony Smith hits irrational, I hit improvisational, right? So in that tension, I know that I'm realizing in relationship again to architecture, infrastructure, and engineering, how far I can pull that line down before the shape crumbles. So I'm aware between the void, the line, and again the interior, like how this space can be occupied by with the body, and how enclosures can happen, right? So one of the things that is really curious about the work of Tony Smith is that at no time can I over-determine its enclosures, right? it's such a complicated geometry that I can't really fix myself between or inside of it, but I can fix myself through it, right? So that kind of throughway in relationship to load and weight and movement, I'm really interested in. In this piece, I put mirrors in between so that those who occupied it can have a sense of disorientation, but a way out, right? So I don't insert sort of reflectivity or ideas of sort of reflection in order to see oneself, but to see oneself through space, right? So,
And the audience or the viewers, the person who comes in, I mean, this is a shot from a series of performances that were organized associated with this work. But what about when the work is stationary within the gallery? Like, how is the viewer invited in that way to go inside? Encouraged?
not encouraged, but absolutely, it's fine to.
It is.
Yes,
Okay.
it's absolutely, it's fine to. A lot of viewers come and sort of stick their heads through and sort of make their way through. So we make them so they can be occupied.
Yeah.
But I don't make forms necessarily to be programmed, right? I make them so that they can be programmed or not.
Programmed, or meaning like with performances, or because also sometimes I see the work. Would you call them prompts, the sculptural forms for the performances?
No,
No?
I wouldn't call them prompts. No, I imagine that individuals can occupy them and engage with them or not. That if there's, I sort of stand by this idea that with the sculptures, again, they can be programmed or not. So in architecture, there's a lot of conversation on what's the program for the space, what's the activity for the space. And my argument is that the space can be as quiet as I am, right? The sort of most eloquent equation of space for me is sort of this sort of refusal of an over-program or movement, and the radical piece is sort of stillness and observation, right? So when when performances happen, these are relationships that I've mostly had for a very long time to engage ideas of refusal, interiority, movement, resistance, enclosures, right? So they work alongside these things, but they're absolutely not necessary.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you. I want to talk about language in the title, but I also want Tom to ask the same question. So I'm going to move on to Tom to here, and then come back because I wanted to talk about language with both of you. I thought we could look at Black Box.
Yeah, so this is sort of what I was referring to earlier. This was my first sort of formal engagement. Maybe I jumped the gun with that, but I mean, this was when I was really thinking about the relationship of known architectural spaces that I was trying to reference indirectly, and I think that this conversation about abstraction is important here, and that how through certain kinds of abstraction, or I might even bring into the idea of abstraction indirectness, a lack of literalness allows one to get to a political or social point that one wants to make, rather than simply pointing at something. When a lot of this work emerged, when I was thinking about structures around excuse me, queer identity, homophobia, social politics in New York City, elsewhere, I was also very concerned about representation. I was concerned about the reductive aspects of representation, which I found kind of humorous relative to the notion of reductive art. And I think, as you were already discussing, I saw this incredible potential through blankness, through space, through the non-said, to perhaps get at something. And so in this situation, in a context, particularly through the AIDS crisis, where the representation of the body was often very literal, and we learned to perform that very quickly, and to deliver that. So I was through this kind of abstractness of using architectural space and negative space, I was able to get at certain ideas that I wouldn't have otherwise. And with this work, one of the things that starts to come into play is this sort of dialectical relationship that I've always seemed to have, and it emerged over time, which has to do with certain kind of formal aspects and spatial aspects, which might be the work in the foreground, coming up against the work in the background, which is the bulletin board. The bulletin board may start in a certain way as this idea of the excess of what I was working on. It was the images I was thinking about that then I would transform into this. I would edit away, chip away at, and then so now I wanted those two things to be together. I wanted one that seemed to be quite, have quite a bit of volume, have sort of representational identification, images, juxtapositions to come up against this more spatial negative space.
You're also like dealing with like the history of minimalism and like the specific object and its relationship to like the body. And supposedly the problem that Michael Fried would have had was that, you know, if the object is contingent in some way on the body. So there introduces a level of theatricality that, you know, makes it very difficult then to assess whether it's painting or sculpture and so forth. And you've seen, I don't know, because you're inviting, both of you, like I think what we're getting at is like inviting the body to be absolutely integrated into it, especially with this work.
You know, interestingly enough, and it's hard to see here, but there is also mirrored surface inside these as well.
I can barely see that.
I've always really been attracted to sort of what I think of as sort of dumb techniques, sort of this idea of how American function, that it just is that simple, but that it absolutely brings the body into it, but not just any body, the viewer's body in that space, and it reflects part of that space, and I do it again and again and again, and it comes up against the kind of what I talked about earlier, that kind of almost opacity that I was reading from certain minimalist works, from Tony Smith's work, but his was not a mirror, but I think some of these titles and forms, and the fact that the plywood versus the steel and that kind of inconclusiveness allowed a crack. Those titles allowed a crack.
Yeah, I think I want to skip over this image and go to Deep Purple because it relates to what we're talking about, I think, as well as what you mentioned earlier, because you used the word appropriation. And what about like reconstruction? Because I guess I would like to talk more about how you see your work appropriating the work, or if you would actually see it actually reconstructing the work.
I stick by what I said. No, I mean, I guess I use the word appropriation because I think it's important to know where my work came from. And I think that when I was schooled, when I was studying, I was working, my instructors were Craig Owens, were Barbara Kruger, were Jenny Holzer, were Martha Rossler. And I was thinking a lot about photographic appropriation, about stepping into someone else's shoes, about putting identity into question, my identity, making that destabilized. So I think about appropriation in those terms, of the idea of appropriating another practice almost as a material.
Yeah.
So that there's plywood, there's mirror, there's Tony Smith.
Yeah.
List of materials, and I think of that coming up against my own name. Yeah. As well.
I think that in this case you've appropriated entire sort of discourse, and it's been generated around Richard Serra's Tilted Arc in that case. I mean, if we're along these lines, it's more than Richard Serra's work or a work. It's the controversy around the removal of Tilted Arc from Federal Plaza.
Right, that, you know, I'm sure everybody knows, but Tilted Arc was a work created by Richard Serra in 1980 at Federal Plaza in New York City. Corten steel, large structure, brought down in 1989. Very interestingly, just the 80s, this decade, right? And was probably the most famous contemporary contested public sculpture, court battle, etc. But also a kind of real emblem of masculinity, of permanence, of a sort of controversy of how people use space, because there was the debate about how the space was destroyed during the day for the people who worked in the building at Federal Plaza. But there was also another discourse, which was how this tilted arc was being used at night by needle users, by gays, but also this potential threat of terrorism and certain anxiety about the work. So that's the tilted arc I wanted to kind of gather up a little bit, was what were the kind of alternative uses of it, what were the anxieties around it. And then also thinking about this history of site specificity. So whereas with Richard Serra, to remove the work was to destroy the work, Deep Purple's much more promiscuous than that and much more opportunistic. It was like a pup tent that could get erected elsewhere, could be taken apart, put back up, got battered along the way, aged,
So it's not reconstructed new every time.
No, I thought it would be. I designed it, or I created it like a work of conceptual art, like a Lawrence Weiner.
Okay.
So as if it would be remade, and then that didn't happen. So then I made it in Braunschweig, Germany, in an exhibition. Then it came to the Whitney Museum, and then it went back over to Lausanne, and the same pile of plywood went back and forth. And I had to kind of readjust my discussions around it to be one about maintenance, preservation, and aging relative to remaking. There are two versions. It was when it was acquired by an institution in France, I retained the ability to make a second version because I wanted more mobility and more play. And there's one in the United States.
Okay. I want to now bring in this conversation or idea about then the title. Can you talk about the title? And with that, like, 'cause language then for both of you becomes integral to the work. And I ask this because Tony Smith, I think, like I sense a tension between like the phenomenological and the experience of the object as a thing that isn't supposed to represent anything. And then the titles that come from different literature sources that therefore even begin to represent something like an image. So there is a reading of it. And that exists, I believe, in a lot of Smith's work, to the point where even like Moondog is a work that has the characteristics of this kind of like fantastic moondog figure, comes from a source, yet it also offers an experience that's all its own. And for both of you, and not just you alone, but I feel like it's like this, the object itself offers an experience, but then there is representation in language and in also images. So maybe, I guess, just departing from that, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about Deep Purple, and then I'd like to go back to like the liquid at place as well.
I made this work in the year 2000 for an exhibition in Braunschweig, Germany. It was a Palladian villa, and this work was to go outside. And it started off, if I can remember correctly, as just I had an interest in barriers. It didn't start with Sarah. I was interested in roadside, highway walls, things like this, partitions. That's how I recently looked back at my notes, so I don't have that good of a memory, but I looked back at my notes. And then I started thinking about camouflage, and then I started to think about, and I did start to think about Sarah's form. And then I wanted to think about if this sort of Corten steel thing and this permanence and this almost, not simply in his work, but also the work of architects at the time, Kevin Roach, others, started to be a kind of masculinist gesture, one that I happen to like, but also one to work against. I wanted to pick a color that seemed extraordinarily kind of artificial and decorative, and that was typically associated with the notion of decor, and perhaps even has like a kind of almost tacky kind of quality. And then the title, of course, took a long time to get to, but then when I love things, again, maybe perhaps with this idea of the matrix that are a little bit overdetermined, like that work in a number of different ways at once. So it brings in the notion of this kind of potential sound, of course. It brings in something, this loudness, this garishness, but it brings in youth culture, alternative uses and subcultures. But on the other hand, it's simply a description of the color. You know, I like that it can walk on both sides of the street that way. And titles for me are most interesting when they anchor for a second and then explode it a little bit and let you go in about 3 different directions.
Okay, I have some questions about that, and maybe also, Torkwase, if we could talk a little bit about this, but also in relation to language, because the title here too, nautical dust, and liquid a place is a verb, like you liquid. So it's also, I want to talk a bit about how that title came about.
Yeah, so liquid a place, with each of my projects and exhibitions, I really write a lot, and I write myself to form sometimes. So the drawing and the writing sort of come hand in hand. And when I was thinking about working in London, working on the Thames, and working on the docks, the history of the transatlantic trade in that region of the world, I really wanted to think and express something that had to do with liquidity. And I didn't want to bring literal water in the room, right? So because water is such a central part of my practice and who I am, I was sort of, how do I figure this out and how do I think about this? And I thought about, again, the body and my body and how much water I bring in the room every time I step into my own work. So my body is a place, the liquid in it is a place. It has a memory, right? It has a sort of technique. It has a architecture. So when I was writing this, it's a liquid a place. It came directly from prose, poem, sort of essay. And when I land there, then the title gets, the exhibition sort of gets a title. And sometimes I'm writing about how I want to think through the exhibition, and I land on language, and then I place it on the title. Just some of it is intuition, some of it is the rigor of writing and drawing. It sort of just comes through,
And liquid also for you is I don't know, a symbol of resistance. I think, from what I understand too, which also relates to the shapes that inform the hyperworks. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm very aware of ocean, river, meadow, and the history of using bodies of water, as these sort of hyper-capitalist extraction places, right? So I am of water. My people are of water. Water as geography. Blackness is of water. So I'm very aware that water is a part of my belonging and my being. So in order to get to a place where I'm making work about water, I really wanted the audience and people who would come to the show to recognize that they're bringing the water in the room, that they're a place, the architecture of your thoughts and brain, the liquid in it. And, liquidity is not always water. It's oil. It's these different sort of materials. And we bring all of that in our bodies. And I'm really interested in this idea of state change. And water is a really particular kind of metaphor for state change, violence, slow violence, fast violence. And water is a really, I think, a place where these things keep getting more complicated. That humans keep making water more complicated.
And part of this also comes out for you in longer term projects, like the Winter Wells drawing school for liberation.
The Winter Wells Drawing School for Environmental Liberation came really out of me trying to think alongside architects, engineers, and really came out of Hurricane Katrina and understanding how the levees broke. Spike Lee's film, watching this film and understanding the politic behind the built environment as it pertains to water directly. So when Katrina hit, I was in Atlanta at the time. I had 30 people at my house just like that. So that moment really radicalized me, but it also pointed me to engineering and architecture and infrastructure. So that's when I was able to say, okay, we need to really think about how to survive the catastrophe of what sort of modernization started, plantation logic started. So I think about that in relationship to water, but I also think about solutions. So for me, there's no better solution than the history of indigeneity and the history of Black liberation strategies. So those sort of movements, logics, geographies, improvisations, and skills, I have to bring them into the work so that I can understand what I'm doing here right now in this moment of now.
Yeah, I mean, I love it because also, I mean, thinking about the matrix, this is like where this whole constellation of figures who come together through your organization or through a platform that is a framework where you allow this discourse to take place, and you invite it. But is it often connected to an exhibition that has objects, or so it's a component?
Yeah, it depends on the organization that invites me in. I really approach exhibition making as building theses, right? So if the exhibition or the organization, if I don't know much about it and they have some access to information that I really want to sort of dive into and bring pedagogical conditions around, or sort of radical curriculum around, then I form the Winterwell School there to invite people in to have new conversations, right? So it really depends on what I'm developing, who I'm in collaboration with. So not all the exhibitions, but ones that are specifically for moments where invention can be done, a collective agreement on something that needs to sort of shift. All of these things have to be in place for the Winterwells project.
I mean, it's like you are inhabiting sort of the aesthetics of exhibition by creating something for some institutions that provides what one on the front sees as an exhibition for an institution. But then creating this framework that has a kind of discourse generating, mode of activity through contemporary art. And it's leveraging sort of the institutions in different ways and the aesthetics of an exhibition, but giving it something else, giving them more. For the reason to produce knowledge and to educate and to inform. And I think that goes back to where like the tensions between this idea of the object as a phenomenological experience without meaning that we have come out of from a long history of art, and also with your work in some cases as well, Tom, where the work represents something. There are objects that can be experienced, but also there are meanings that can be read, and something therefore also taken away. And I wondered if we might talk a bit about what I see as a long-term project for you, the Torrington project, because I think it's also inhabiting different known forms that is conflating exhibition, studio, and so forth. I can forward to one of those slides if you want.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting that's really tying things, these lines of thought together, is this idea of almost a sort of strategic use of the exhibition in a certain way, right? A kind of self-conscious use of it, that it's a medium as well. And I think that's interesting, and I think that's something that is really quite distinct from the idea of simply making objects, right? So that there's this kind of politic to it, and focusing on that, that's one level of it, but then also exploiting and playing and exploding the very politics of it to a certain degree, to other means in a certain way. And what James is referring to is this project that I've been sort of a somewhat nebulous project, but that I've been working on for the last year and a little bit, is I've never been an artist that has been very comfortable in any kind of traditional studio environment. It has never been something that I needed. It's something that I've had. I've never taken it for granted. I've worked on a table like this, or I've worked in a somewhat large space, or I've worked on site. Quite nomadic in that way, and I'm comfortable with that. But I wanted to play with a couple of things. I needed to test some of the limits of where I was working, the people that I was working with. I needed to take certain things over. I was curious, you brought up the point of Deep Purple. You were saying I assumed that was made over and over again. Well, when you work in certain materials, certain galleries, certain other players in my midst may choose, when I can't afford to dismantle a work or destroy a work, and it can always be remade again. And that's partly my logic, but I've also resisted that over time because patina, and I don't mean rust, I mean the patina of showing something over and over again, the value that starts of place that starts to get attached to something. I want to choose when that is attached or not attached. So I became more interested in that, issues of storage, issues of when I deliver work to the world. All of those networks, I wanted to sort of highlight them. I wanted to create them as sort of stress points. So I took a very large space, large for me, for what I'm doing, where I could recreate some of these earlier works that had been another work that I guess you see it here, that was from the same year as Deep Purple, but I was working with a gallery in Berlin at the time, so it was shown in an institutional setting and then dismantled and never seen again. And this is an opportunity to bring that work back at the same time that I'm making new work in the space. So it's not an exhibition space and it's not a studio, but I'm doing both of those things there. And it's just as important as all the empty space and the space between things, both temporal and spatial.
It's also like a different way of looking at archive.
Yeah, and it's also
it's visible and alive and activated against other moments in time by objects that come from other moments in time. And also, I think what's interesting is for both of you, like there's a certain sort of the artist figure, the aesthetics of what define the artist figure, but also, like you mentioned earlier, like the curator figure and the organizer, the community organizer, the archivist in this case. So I really appreciate like there isn't a reinforcement of the ideals of what have come down to be the artist figure. There's a multiplicity of activity that's happening that actually refutes in some ways easy definition of that. I feel like what I also like, I mean, just thinking about Tony Smith, and we've been reviewing so many photographs for the catalog raisonné, and there are so many photographs of work in the backyard that are amazing, and how he used the backyard in South Orange, New Jersey as both his studio and exhibition space.